The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Welcome to International Insights. I am Doug Davis, and with me is Michael Slobodchikoff. On this episode, we'll be speaking with Phillip Short. Mr. Short had a long career with the BBC as a foreign correspondent. He spent time in many foreign locations, including Washington and Moscow. He is the author of several definitive biographies focusing on Putin, Mitterrand, Mao, and Pol Pot. Mr. Short, welcome to the show from France.
Good to be with you.
It is truly an honor to speak to you today. And I would like to start with asking that your work considers some of the most important and controversial rulers, as Doug mentioned just a second ago. And your impressive biographies have obviously required years of work to research. How did you choose your topics, and what gave you the strength to persevere and overcome the long hours it took to complete these projects?
How did I choose them? Because I felt, they were written, after all, Mao was written in the 1990s. The biographies take an awfully long time because the research is extremely long. So anything between 5 and 8 or 9 years for one book. And I did Mao in the 1990s, and then Pol Pot, and then Mitterrand, and then Putin. And people say, well, that's a very kind of eclectic, strange collection, but they have a lot in common. They're all very complicated people, and complex people, complex leaders are interesting. If you're going to spend years of your life trying to delve into someone's mind, it better be an interesting person. And the other thing, they all in different ways reflect their times and their countries. The life of Mao is China through the 20th century, China from the time it was a medieval empire at the end of the 19th, to, at the time of Mao's death, a modern power with nuclear weapons, a permanent seat in the UN, a modern economy. And you look at Mao's life, and it really is a mirror of the development of China. The same is true of Pol Pot in different ways. Pol Pot reflected all the kind of paranoia and contradictions and suspicions of Cambodia, little country squeezed in between Vietnam and Thailand, and it really is a paranoid country. Mitterrand, France, again through the 20th century. Putin, in many ways a reflection of Russia. Not many Russians would hate to hear that said, but he is an authentic Russian. He reflects many of the aspirations of Russians, for right or for wrong, and many of their failings, their frailties, the things they get absolutely wrong. But he's Russian.
Excellent. Phillip, what made you choose Putin? So I would like to expand on your answer just for a second, because you'd spent a lot of time researching him. What made you want to study him and write a biography on Putin?
I thought he was the most interesting and important leader around at the time I began, which was 2013, I suppose. I started thinking about Putin. Also, another reason I should have explained, I've lived in all these countries. I would feel very wary of writing about a country or a leader whose culture I had no contact with. Israel is fascinating, but I've never lived in Israel. The Middle East is I've never spent any great amount of time there. So that also has determined who I've written about. And I think that is actually quite important. If you're going to try and go into depth about a leader, then you have to have some understanding of the context. In other words, the country, the culture, the history, and so on. Pick up your earlier question. Michael said, how do you find the energy to put in all these hours? Well, there are people, you have a wonderful biographer in the States who's been working on Lyndon Johnson for the last, 30 or 40 years. You do get fascinated. It's the time, for me, the time comes when I have to draw a halt. One could always go on forever with these subjects because they are endless. They're endlessly fascinating, and there's an endless amount you could find. But I find it a sort of detective job, to try and put the little grains of sand together and figure it out. What is really interesting is what makes somebody behave in the way they do, think in the way they do, what makes them tick. And that's what, in the moments of Great Depression, which occur during all these biographies, that's what I think keeps one going.
Fantastic. I would like to build upon that answer and ask you specifically, how do you go about carrying out the research for these biographies? What type of research process did you use, and what sources do you tend to find the most helpful when researching these biographies?
It depends. I mean, it's different for everybody, but in principle, the British Foreign Office, they have an expression, a Latin expression, ipsissima verba. The word in its essentials, if you like, it's the word in essence. And what they mean by that is you have to go back to what did people say and when did they say it? And so I do try to read everything, or as much as possible of everything that these leaders have said. I mean, with Mao, it's a huge amount. Unfortunately, leaders who live a long time tend to be rather voluble and loquacious, and there's a lot there to read. But as much as possible, and with Putin I certainly did. I read every public statement that he'd made. And some of the most interesting things were the interviews that he gave when he was a junior official, when he was a deputy mayor in St. Petersburg. And for that, I had to go to the Russian archives, the newspaper archives, and go literally through daily paper after daily paper, and you found, after days of finding absolutely nothing, then you would find an interview he'd given. Of course, there's no indexing or anything, so you just have to go through the whole lot. And it's Robert Caro's thing, turn every page. Insofar as you can, you don't give up. You've got to look at everything. And so start with the words. And then the interviews are really important, interviews with people who knew Putin at that time and at later stages of his career, to kind of put things into context. But the trouble with oral interviews is people get the chronology terribly mixed. And chronology is really important. I did an interview with an American ambassador, and he was absolutely American ambassador to Moscow, I won't say which one. He was absolutely sure that a meeting in, I think, Oslo had taken place months before a meeting, and he got them the wrong way around, as we discovered when we looked back at the documents. And that happens all the time. Memories are fallible, but they're above all fallible about dates. And with Cambodia, with Pol Pot, that was a real problem, because a great deal of the material was necessarily oral. Cambodians don't, it's not a culture where people write things all the time, unlike China, unlike Russia for that matter, or France. Cambodia is very oral. And so people would have very precise memories of what was said, but when it was said and in what order, that was much more difficult to figure out.
Excellent. Let me turn back and look at the elements of Putin's history and personality that were most surprising to you as you engaged in this research. and how do they impact Russia's foreign policy?
Well, let me give you just one example. When Putin was a kid, when he was a child, he hung out in the courtyard of his very run-down tenement building in St. Petersburg, and played with the other kids who were little toughs, little tearaways from out on the streets. And he said at one point he didn't want ever to be the leader. He wanted to be the arbitrator. He wanted to be the guy who could settle quarrels, who could put people together. And if you look at the system which Putin actually operates in Russia today, it's very much that. He has become the leader. He's, as the Russians say, the body to whom everybody has to refer and differ. But he balances factions. He balances different groups. He lets them, often quite surprisingly, fight it out in a very public way. When Sechin, who is one of the Russians closest to Putin, he's the head of the gas, of the oil outfit, and has been the chief of staff to Putin. When he set up another leader, Ulukayev, Putin let it happen, even though it was completely obvious that Putin had tricked this guy and set him up and sent him off to prison. Putin let it happen, and the other fellow, Ulukayev, stayed in prison for 2 or 3 years before he was released. He gives quite a lot of latitude. He tends not to interfere. One saw this with Prigozhin, with the Wagner affair. He let Wagner have his head and slag off the defense ministry until Prigozhin went too far and paid for it with his life. But it's a matter of balancing groups, and he does it extremely effectively. That's his system of rule, and you can see it going right back to his childhood. The other thing was very clear about his childhood, which came across his childhood and early adolescence and youth, playing cards close to his chest. No one ever really knew where Putin was coming from, and that has been absolutely consistent throughout his career. So there are things where, the Jesuits always used to say, give me a child of 7 and I can tell you what he's going to become. In Putin's case, yes, you can see very clearly in many ways what the lines of continuity are.
Fantastic. Phillip, for those who wish to understand Russia's place in the world, especially those confused about the invasion of Ukraine, how critical is it to understand Putin himself? And how has Putin personally impacted Moscow's relations with the world?
Michael, I think it's absolutely key. Countries have interests. That has always been the case, and Russia has interests and would have interests whether Putin were there or not. But the way that those interests have been applied, have been conducted, that's very much Putin's personal decision. And when you come to Ukraine, I think the invasion of Ukraine is almost an extreme case of an action which would not have occurred had it not been for Putin being in charge. The Russians talk a lot about NATO expansion having been a cause of it. And it's not entirely wrong. NATO expansion is part of the context. It's been happening since the mid-1990s. Ask yourself, America would not be terribly happy, we've seen this with Cuba, if the Russians were to put troops and missiles right on your borders. Well, the Russians weren't particularly happy, and it's fine for NATO to say, well, it's purely defensive. Well, of course they would say that. And it may well be purely defensive, but it doesn't look that way to Moscow. If you're sitting in Moscow, it's a different issue. So it's part of the context, but it's absolutely not the reason why Putin decided to intervene in Ukraine. He decided to intervene in Ukraine, I think, for two reasons. First of all, he saw a window of opportunity. What happened, the final straw was the chaos of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, which made him think of what had happened in Vietnam, of a lot of the history of US interventions abroad. Basically, the lesson was the US does not have the stomach for a long fight. But above all, during the period of COVID, when he was very much in isolation and thinking to himself about his future, after all, he's 70, coming up to 72 now, he was 70 then, and he was thinking about the legacy, his place in history. The crowning achievement for Putin would be to bring Ukraine back into what he sees as the Russian fold. Now, of course, that's not how the Ukrainians see it. There's a lot of mythologizing in Russia, and Putin himself is a myth maker about it. But he has been, Bill Burns says it, and Bill Burns is absolutely right. Ukraine has been a Putin obsession for the last 30 years. You can go back and find him talking about Ukraine really furiously about the way that Ukraine was taken away from Russia in the early 1990s. It's been a really deep-seated thing. So for him, his legacy, his place in history would be if I can bring Ukraine back. And in that sense, Ukraine's really a special case. It's not the first step towards some kind of reconstitution of the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. It's an end in itself because for Russians and for Putin, Ukraine is a huge part of Russian self-identity.
Excellent. Philip, I'd like to follow up on this and ask you, given your study of Putin, what is necessary for there to be a positive outcome for the Ukraine war?
Depends what you mean by a positive outcome. And that's that. I mean, I'm not being clever in saying that. Doug, it's the great thing. We have never defined what we want in Ukraine. I say we, the West, and the West which is supporting the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have said quite understandably they want to kick the Russians out, go back to the borders they had before 2014. If I were a Ukrainian, I would say that too. Realistically, it's not going to happen. So, and we know it's not going to happen. So fatigue sets in the West, not just in the US, but in Europe as well. How much longer will we go on supporting Ukraine? How strongly will we support Ukraine? What kind of outcome do we want and will we accept? And it's no good saying, I mean, I understand why Western governments say, oh, it's up to the Ukrainians, but actually it isn't. It's up to us as well. If we really felt this was an existential struggle which threatened our existence, we would send our own troops. We don't. And for a very good reason. It's not an existential struggle. It's a struggle which is extremely important in terms of American credibility, Western credibility, but it doesn't threaten us directly. So positive outcome, I mean, my guess is eventually, and I'm not saying anything particularly original, we'll have a line of separation, an armistice, some kind of freeze, which gives Russia a fair amount of the territory it wants, that it's holding, and security guarantees to Ukraine. And really the question is how much more bloodshed is going to have to go on before the two sides are sufficiently exhausted to agree to something of that kind. It's not a happy story, and I don't really think that can be considered a positive outcome, but it's the outcome we're likely to get.
I would like to turn to the start of the new millennium and ask you that Putin has been described often as the accidental president. How true is that? And what did Yeltsin, who resigned, making Putin his successor see in him when he chose Putin?
Michael, I think accidental is probably too strong a word. Putin, it's true, Putin did not seek the presidency. He didn't, he wasn't the little boy who was standing outside the White House with his parents being photographed. This is going to be yours one day, my son. He never struggled to climb the greasy pole of political advancement, but he managed quietly to make himself indispensable almost wherever he went. That was true in St. Petersburg when he was deputy mayor. It was true in the presidential administration. Then he became head of the KGB, of the FSB. Every time he was where he was needed, and he was the man who could make things happen. So I think to say accidental president is putting the stress wrongly. He was ambitious. His wife Lyudmila was one of the few who actually said yes, he does have. He wants to be something, and I think that comes through. And when I say indispensable, Yeltsin, at having been very dependent on the oligarchs, the seven bankers, Berezovsky and his friends, who bankrolled his campaign in the 1996 election, he'd become too dependent on them, and he wanted a strong, not just one, but a group of stronger people who were going to help him stand up to them. And Putin, Siloviki, one of the people from the force ministries, as they say, he was the obvious candidate, and he did the job. He was there, he could do it, and that's fundamentally why Yeltsin decided to appoint him.
Excellent. Phillip, how has Putin changed in the 20-plus years he has been running the country?
Good question, Gerg. He has changed. His foreign policy has changed. His domestic policy has changed. He's become more and more dictatorial, more and more repressive at home. The space for free discussion has been progressively squeezed, and it's not just since the war in Ukraine. One of the big turning points was 2012 when he came back to power, having been prime minister for 4 years. He came back to the presidency, and there were demonstrations against that, and they were repressed pretty brutally. Well, after that, the screws were tightened and tightened again. In foreign policy, it's very difficult to remember all this because it's so long ago. But if you go back to 2001, you go back to the Al-Qaeda attacks, Putin amazed George W. Bush by the amount of cooperation he gave. And he was criticized within Russia. The Russians said, look, why are you helping the Americans so much? They're not giving you anything back. And Putin said, look, this is not Putin's policy. Rapprochement with the West is Russia's policy. There was, in those early days, in the early 2000s, there was a real attempt to come to terms with the West. Now, it failed, partly, I think one has to say, because we in the West took the view that Russia had lost the Cold War and Russia had to eat its spinach, as the Clinton administration put it, and partly because the Russians also had very serious reservations about a harmonious and happy relationship with the West. Again, Bill Burns really summed this up best when he said there were illusions and delusions on both sides. Both sides each misread the other. And if you look at it, two powers who both regard themselves as exceptional, You Americans certainly do, the Russians certainly do. It's kind of built into the equation that there's going to be friction there. And America was not going to give up, very understandably, not going to give up its prime position to accept equality with Russia, and the Russians weren't going to accept anything else except equality with America. So it was kind of written into it. It was baked into the deal that it was going to turn sour one way or the other, and it did.
I would like to ask you, Philip, to discuss the Putin system and how it works currently in Russia.
Well, as I said earlier, the fundamental of the system is playing off groups against each other, giving them a lot of latitude, and being the arbitrator, being the one man who, when push comes to shove, everybody knows that this is the guy who will decide. And Putin really is now in a position where, if you like, he's the keystone at the top of the arch. Everything rests on him. And that makes the system actually quite stable, because all the people below know that they depend on him, that they can't shake things too much, that their fate, if you like, is bound up with Putin's fate, and they all sink together or float together. So it's a much more stable system than you would expect. The other analogy which is sometimes used is a pile of tumble timber. You know, you pull out one bit, and it's okay. But if you pull out too many bits, the whole lot comes crashing down. And Putin has systematically, when he pulls out one bit, he puts it somewhere else. So the pile remains not so much changed. And that's another way of looking at the system. He's not like Yeltsin, who would say, you know, this guy's dismissed. And before the man, he was even told his official telephone would be cut off and everything else would happen. Yeltsin was very, decisive, like an old-style czar in that way. Putin isn't. He's much more manipulative. And when he moves somebody, almost always he moves them sideways so that they can be used again or they can be put somewhere else. But the system, the whole system, remains not that different from before.
Well, Philip, this has been a great pleasure. Unfortunately, we've used up our full allotment of time, and I very much enjoy this, and I hope that someday we can have you come back on our program.
Doug, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
It was truly an honor for both of us to speak to you, and I know, speaking for myself, I learned a tremendous amount today, so thank you.
Michael, a pleasure. Thank you very much.